In previous videos, I've shown you a few ways that you can position page elements. There is, however, another powerful property called float that can help us lay out web pages. The float property is probably the most misunderstood property in CSS. The theory of how the property works is sound, but designers, developers, and older browsers often misinterpret how the float property works. Since the early days of the web, it's been possible to float text around images. One gets the idea from beautiful typesetting and illuminated manuscripts dating back to almost the dawn of paper. It's very common for text to flow around images, so it should certainly be possible on the web. It doesn't stop with text though. With floated elements, you can create all sorts of intricate page layouts and create columns and grid systems. We won't get into anything terribly complex in this video because the float property by itself is complex enough. So as you can see here, we have a somewhat more complex page than what we normally have. More on that in a minute. And again, our markup is a little bit more complex than what we're used to, but nothing we haven't seen already. We have our div right here, and we have a few blocks of paragraph text. We also have some CSS to bootstrap the page, which is a little bit more than what we usually have, but again, nothing we haven't seen already. And here is where we're going to be doing our CSS. So this page looks pretty ugly from an aesthetic perspective, but the point of this exercise is to get you to understand what floats are actually doing on the page. The element that we're going to be floating first is the orange one with the black dashed border. We have two blocks of paragraph text outlined in light blue and light yellow. And then we have a wrapper set to a middle gray in the background. As you can see, the orange element is sitting on top of these two blocks of text. That's because in the HTML, the orange block comes first, and then the first paragraph, and finally the second paragraph. We want to make the orange element float to the left and have the paragraph text flow around it. So let's do just that, and then I'll explain each part. So switching back to the text editor, let's first select our element of my div, and then we'll float it to the left, and we'll give it a margin of about 30 pixels. So when we switch back to the browser and refresh, there we have it. Now you're probably thinking, that didn't look so hard, but there's a lot going on here. And in more complex layouts, there are dozens of floated elements, and it's easy to get lost if you don't understand how floats work. The float property accepts three values, which are left, right, and none. In this case, we floated our element to the left. When you float an element to the left or right, the browser will push that element as far to the left as it possibly can. Because the floated element is nested inside of the wrapper in the HTML, it will be contained to the wrapper. Normally it would be touching the edge, but I've added 30 pixels of margin all the way around so that you can better understand what's going on here. Now look at the paragraph text. The actual text inside of the paragraph element is being pushed over by the floated element. However, if you look at the paragraph element by itself, its border still extends all the way to the edge and completely ignores the floated element. Why is this? Well, there's several different ways an element can behave on a web page. The two primary behaviors that you'll encounter when dealing with layout issues are block level elements and inline elements. Paragraphs are block level elements, so let's try changing them to inline and then see what happens. So switching back to our text editor, we'll go ahead and select all the paragraphs on the page, and we'll change them to display inline, and we'll switch back to the browser and refresh. And as you can see, the borders are no longer extending behind the floated element. Instead, the borders are wrapping around the text, which is very unusual, but it demonstrates the idea. And that is that block level elements generate what's called a block box. They have a line break before and after them. An inline element, which we have here, has no line breaks before or after and will simply flow right around the next inline element. Let's remove the borders so that you can see the paragraphs better. So we'll switch back to our text editor, and keeping the display inline property, we'll go ahead and remove the borders. So we'll switch back to the browser and refresh. And as you can see, the end of the first paragraph doesn't have a break after it, and the start of the second paragraph doesn't have a break before it. They simply flow right into one another. Inline elements will respect floated elements, whereas a block level element will simply ignore them. A paragraph is a block level element, but the text inside of a paragraph is actually in line. That's why the borders of the paragraphs extended past the floated element, but the text flows around it. Now let's put the borders back on the paragraphs and switch them back to block level elements, because we're going to try something else. So we'll switch back to our text editor, and we'll go ahead and just remove this entire style rule. And we'll switch back to our browser and refresh, and there's what we had before. Now earlier I mentioned that we weren't going to get into anything too fancy like floated grid layouts, which form the foundation of most CSS frameworks, but I'd like to give you an idea of how a layout could be built up using floated elements. So our orange div is already floated to the left. Let's float the rest of these elements to the left, and the first thing you have to do when floating an element is give it an explicit width. Before we started this video, the orange element already had an explicit width, but the paragraphs currently do not. So let's do that now. So we'll go ahead and select all the paragraphs again, and we'll add a width of about 300 pixels, and we'll switch back and refresh. Now this no doubt looks very strange, but remember, even though we've set a narrow width on these elements, they're still block level paragraphs, so their borders will ignore the floated orange box, like you can see here, but the text will respect the floated element and flow around it. Next, let's float these paragraphs, and let's also give them some margin so they don't run right up against one another. So we'll switch back and go ahead and float these paragraphs to the left, and we'll give them a margin right of about 20 pixels. And there you have it. We have our orange div all the way to the left and 2 columns of paragraph text. At this point, we've covered all the major concepts in CSS. In the next 2 videos, we're going to embark on a CSS project.